It has been said, nothing happens in a vacuum. Each event is connected to the last and to the next. So to best understand what's happening in the present, we need to be aware of what happened in the past, how one thing led to another. Right now, we are watching, in shock and dismay, the atrocities being inflicted daily upon the people of Gaza, as it has been ever since the October 7th massacres in Israel. Yet that deadly day did not start this story, but marked a sharp turn in its arc. That day was not a genesis but a reckoning, generations in the making. Reckless, yes, but by no means random. The fire was not sparked then, its flames only reached new heights, its pain new depths. And we are paying attention. But to find real solutions, and advocate for them effectively, we should see the source of the problem clearly, trace it back to its tap roots. It's complicated, they say, and it's true that there is more context called for in this case than in more straightforward colonial campaigns such as the Spanish in Central America, the French in Africa, the British in India, the Americas, and across practically all continents. It's an oversimplification to paint the circumstances in Israel-Palestine as just another parallel, for two major reasons. 1. None of those colonial groups were fleeing serious persecution, as Jews were before, during, and after the Holocaust. They did not spontaneously set out to conquer new lands. Most were fleeing for their lives. 2. None of those colonial groups had prior heritage in the areas they colonized, as Jews did in the lands that were once known as Judea and Samaria. Alas, the implementation of Zionism, the endeavor to create a nation-state of Hebrew-speaking Jewish majority on those lands in modern times, has definitely had destructive similarities to other colonial enterprises, including forced displacement of prior inhabitants, disturbing and long-standing abuses of human rights, inequality of access to resources and civil protections, and general degradation, erasure even, of the local culture. It's also true that the legacy of conflict in the Middle East is indeed long and at times convoluted. Empires have risen and fallen. To be more specific, but also, to make a very long story relatively short, ancient Israelite civilization is understood to have emerged from that of the Canaanites more than 3,000 years ago. But Assyrian and Babylonian conquerors took hold of Israel and Judah between 700 to 500 BC, destroying their main temple and other aspects of Jewish heritage. Many were exiled. Those who remained became vulnerable to abuse not only from the tyrants who were now directly dominating them, but so too from neighboring tribes. In subsequent times, under more tolerant rulers, they were allowed to return and were able to reconstruct much of their culture, until around 70 AD, when the Romans brutalized Jewish uprisings and destroyed their second temple. Many were killed. Within a couple of generations, in an attempt to further erase Jewish identity and culture, Roman dictators decided to stop using the Jewish place names and absorbed the area, including Jerusalem and Galilee, into the province called Syria Palestina. Over the next several hundred years, political powers came from Persia and Greece and had their peaks of influence as well. Languages spoken over the course of these eras included Hebrew, Phoenician, Aramaic, Greek, Latin. Forward a few hundred more years, in the 7th century, Arab armies defeated the Byzantines and extended their rule to encompass the region. In the 1300s, Mongol raiders made their way in. Meanwhile, by this time in Europe, some countries were already expelling Jews. Back in the Middle East, between the Jordan River and the Mediterranean Sea, under the Mongols, Turks, and to present time, essentially Arab cultural traditions have persisted. That fact has been inaccurately and inappropriately wielded in modern discourse in a sort of ideological war against present-day Palestinians, because though they now speak primarily Arabic and predominantly practice Islam, this does not negate their indigenous ties to the land. Consider, through a similar lens, how indigenous people in many colonized places of the world, who now speak English and/or practice Christianity and/or have mixed genetics, are not therefore English, at least not solely. They have adopted or been forced into accepting the languages, religious affiliations, and other conventions of the dominant society. So even if many of their original customs have been altered, lost, or replaced, they retain their indigeneity, especially since those losses are so often due to restrictions imposed by foreign invaders, whether under threat of violence, or through sincere religious persuasion, or for more practical matters, such as the many residents of the region who converted to Islam in order to pay less taxes to caliphs whose policies favored Muslims. We should keep such factors in mind when endeavoring to fairly evaluate ancestry and belonging. Finally, of course, in time, this portion of the Levant became known simply as Palestine. No matter the details thereof, the current indigenous peoples of over 1,000 years' residency cannot be called the instigators of modern hostilities. Ethnic and religious fluctuations have taken place over the course of many centuries, some of which were due to invasions, other times peaceful immigration, and at other times mass religious conversions, not always voluntary. To claim, as Zionist proponents have done, that present-day Palestinians are fundamentally foreigners to the land, just some scattered remnants of Arab caliphates who can now rightfully be expelled, is a supremacist ideology which, in addition to being intrinsically inhumane, is also not supported by, and in fact contrary to, modern genetic and archaeological evidence. And no matter how each group originally arrived and integrated, no amount of cultural complexity can justify apartheid, much less what we are seeing now. Weeks upon weeks of one of the world's most advanced militaries callously massacring unarmed civilians, including thousands of women and children, and destroying all of the infrastructure that survivors would need in order to return to any semblance of a normal life, or life at all, when the violence stops. No nuance, no historical perspective makes ethnic cleansing remotely acceptable, and revenge is not defense. That being said, I, as many do, truly wish for Jewish people to have a safe homeland. After the unfathomable cruelty inflicted onto them during the Holocaust, it is patently unfair to tell them that such a desire is unwarranted or unreasonable. Clearly, they need it. Is protection of one primary ethnicity as a core tenet undemocratic when millions of people of other ethnicities reside there as well? Probably. But many nations around the world are undemocratic, and we are not telling each of them that they have no right to exist. Although, the State of Israel laid the foundation for much of its modern society upon the rubble of another, which they had overpowered. A transgression that has been committed by many groups across time and across continents. And in this case, as in every other, it is an event regrettable to the fullest extent of the word. Yet, there are still layers to unpack here, as paradoxically, prior civilizations had also laid their foundations upon the rubble of ancient Israel. In light of that, it is at best a naively simplistic view, absurd really, to suggest that the erasure of modern-day Israel to make way for the entire original territory of Palestine would resolve the situation. It's obviously out of the question. Now, logically, if half of a country was going to be endowed to their Jewish refugees after World War II, it should have been Germany, the worst of their persecutors. But that's not going to happen either, is it? Such a scenario, even if it would indeed be the closest thing to justice, is impractical, and to advocate for things outside the realm of possibility is a waste of time. Also, suggestions that would cause great harm to some in the process of creating reconciliation for others are bound to perpetuate conflict and be detrimental to lasting progress, just as Israel's expansion in Palestine has been. Pull the pendulum too far in one direction, it tends to end up swinging in the other. A sustainable peace will be found in the balance, especially considering that a local Hebrew-speaking Jewish culture can in fact be traced back to the 2nd millennium BC. So who is indigenous in the Holy Land? Based on DNA and ancient artifacts, both peoples, multiple peoples. This is why the only thing you will hear me calling for, from the river to the sea, is a ceasefire, and afterwards, freedom and equality for all people in the region. for Jewish people and Palestinian people have both been persecuted severely, and unwittingly pitted against each other by extraordinarily selfish and irresponsible imperial powers. That's not to say being Jewish and being Israeli are synonymous, for they are certainly not, but Israel is the only Jewish majority nation in the world. To paint either side of the acute conflict as absolute victim or offender is a narrow view that will only lead to more of the same. A pro-Palestinian may say, haven't European colonists taken enough and done damage enough in the world already, to natives across entire continents, and here, to us? They have taken everything. We just want to live. Get them out. While a Zionist may say, don't Arabs have enough nations, land, and people already? For us Jews, this small state is our only safe national home in all the world. We were expelled first. We just want to live. Get them out. And to a degree, they may both be right, although not with the wish to get the other out, which is a sure route to a stalemate where neither group ever has true security, or worse, where one side builds up enough force to expel or annihilate the other. But as we said, Zionism cannot inherently be chalked up to just more European colonizers. On the other hand, to identify Palestinians vaguely only as Arabs, as if they do not have diversity, as if they do not have dialects and culture of themselves, is a cop-out, a maneuver that unfairly tries to diminish their value as a unique people in order to justify displacing them. Also, regardless of cultural factors, regardless of similarities and connections between Palestinians and other Arab populations, millions of people cannot be dehumanized just because there are millions elsewhere whom you view as ubiquitous. Such a stance, which attempts to rationalize or minimize the gravity of the annihilation or forced removal of Palestinians en masse, is not somehow less offensive than that of counter-extremists, aka terrorists, aiming to kill or displace Israelis and wipe their state off the map. That principle should be completely self-evident. However, based on the evidence, reminders are needed. Indeed, Israelis may have greater civil liberties amongst themselves, but by no means do they have the moral high ground in the international arena. Clearly, the systemic ethical ineptitude that defines Western colonialism has thoroughly infected their collective mentality and become the deepest of swamps, one which, unfortunately, they have, as of yet, failed to drain. And you can hardly expect to gain respect without giving it. You cannot sow persecution and harvest peace. So there are two choices now: more stubbornness and suffering, or compassionate compromise. We can continue to point to mistakes made and wrongs committed in the past as excuses for more animosity in the present. Or we can learn from the past to improve the present, for everyone's benefit. Does that mean everyone can get what they want? Of course not. No one who wants everything will ever get what they want. Same goes for nationalist movements. But everyone can have sufficiency, can exist, can live, with dignity and liberty. And that's worlds better than destroying each other in a mad dash to have it all, isn't it? Did early Zionist pioneers, under the dubious tutelage of Britain, make a massive mistake and an ethical failure to pretend that Palestinians were not a people per se, and that the land of Palestine was available to be had as their own? They did. The lands they purchased, acquired legally, were theirs to lay claim to. That was about 7% in 1947, before they took more than half of the land by force. And the rest has been illegally annexed since then, during wars and through steady settler colonialism, enforced through terrorist tactics including routine kidnappings, extrajudicial killings, and other methods of control and intimidation such as blockades, checkpoints, arbitrary detentions, beatings, interrogations, and seizures of personal property. But did Palestinian leaders and militias, even if they had the moral and literal high ground, also make a grave mistake by deciding that rather than let Zionists found their own nation-state on a portion of what was formerly Palestine, they would instead drive them back and keep it all? They did, though it was more of a strategic mistake than an ethical one, as there were no solid grounds for the UN to grant the majority of the land to Jews, who were a minority of the population. What people in the world would be willing to hand over their homes and farms by the thousands? It was nothing more than institutionalized theft. Granted, the quality of land in each region and its potential for productive agriculture is a discussion of itself. However, no conclusions that may be drawn in that regard can diminish in any measure the injustice and short-sightedness of a partition plan that implied the subjugation or displacement of over 200,000 local inhabitants. Safe to say, whoever thought that was a good idea was, objectively speaking, sorely lacking in morality and/or intelligence. It was a recipe for disaster, and that's exactly what it became. The decision by the locals to fight for it was one they couldn't have seen the consequences of until it was done, which didn't happen all at once. The majority of the land was taken in 48, but more was also taken 20 years later, after the failed military efforts in the Six-Day War by Egypt, Jordan, Syria, and Lebanon, nations which Zionist pioneers had initially intended to take portions of also, as stated in their appeals to the British for support of their colonial goals. Ultimately, the resistance opted for all or nothing, and unfortunately have ended up with almost nothing. Yet in actuality, was the entire situation either group's fault? Separately or even in combination, they were both forced into an impossible predicament by 1. Genocidal tyrants and pogroms elsewhere in the world, and 2. The irresponsible double-dealing of colonial overlords, who chose to chop Palestine in half, despite that it meant upheaval for hundreds of thousands of Palestinians, most of whom were Muslim, but there were also Christians and Jews already there, coexisting much more amicably than at any time after the Balfour Declaration, which is, long story short, to get help in World War I, Britain made promises they couldn't keep, to both Jews and Palestinians, and there hasn't been peace ever since. Bottom line, if the governments of more powerful states, being primarily Britain, France, Germany, Russia, and the US, did not enable racist policies and campaigns, and had more integrity in their international relations and operations, the bloodshed we are seeing now could more than likely have been avoided. But at what point do the groups with the most at stake have to separate themselves from the failings of their handlers, take responsibility, and choose peace? Wouldn't this be the most true expression of their fundamental values? Maybe it's too idealistic to hope for such a fantastic degree of spiritual resilience from groups who have been through so much abuse. But if the alternative is endless violence, that's a hope worth holding on to. Especially considering that before they were repeatedly occupied by imperial forces, Palestinians were by and large peaceful people. Indeed, this is one of the reasons they were not able to successfully defend their homelands in 48. They were not a militarized society. They were not commonly soldiers, much less terrorists. Most were traditionally farmers, and over time also teachers, doctors, artists, builders. They were not warmongers, nor are they even today. Hamas is less than 2% of the population in Gaza, and did not even found their resistance movement until 40 years after the Nakba, when hundreds of thousands of their people were displaced and thousands killed. To go a step further back, and we must, Jews were also by and large a peaceful people, before they were persecuted, particularly in Eastern Europe, prompting the beginning of Zionist immigration to Palestine in the late 1800s and early 1900s. Jews were also persecuted in and driven out of Russia, and Jews left Arab nations for a number of reasons, both push and pull factors. A primary pull was the lobbying of Israel for their immigration to Israel in order to build up a Jewish majority there. But that lobbying was effective partially because their circumstances were already subpar in those Arab nations, some of which treated them as second-class citizens, or worse, a problem to be dealt with, especially after the partition of Palestine and the Arab-Israeli War, which increased anti-Semitism throughout the Arab world, though perhaps not quite to the degree that Israel would have us believe. Israel destabilized relations further in order to draw Jews to their cause. There are even accounts of Israeli agents staging terror attacks in Jewish areas of Arab states in order to exaggerate the perception and fear of anti-Semitism and thus propel Arab Jews towards Israel, where they could expect safety, but also, as it turned out, to still be lower-class citizens, compared to European Jews. At the very least, Israeli officials offered incentives such as land and economic opportunities, and applied political pressure on Arab states. But the discussion of what the primary reasons were for Jewish populations to diminish in Arab nations is a contentious one. Zionist proponents tend to imply that it has been by outright expulsion, comparing it to the Palestinian Nakba and trying to paint a picture of equivalency, a sort of population exchange. The problem with that notion is that Palestinians, whether or not they wanted to leave, which of course, as we know, they did not, were unable to immigrate to Arab nations where Jews had left, to safely start over. They have essentially been refugees ever since. So there was no exchange. People who were robbed or marginalized began robbing and marginalizing other people. Meanwhile, most countries did not hold the door open for Jewish refugees either, to say the least. This included the United States of America, which turned Jewish refugees away by the boatload. This dynamic, of course, reached fever pitch in the 1940s after millions of Jews were traumatized to the extreme during the Holocaust. This led to their dramatically increased immigration to Palestine and founding of the modern state of Israel. But wait, we'll backtrack now, because the Zionist movement was in motion already, before World War II, at a less drastic but still significant intensity. It included economic dispossession and, to a degree, even geographic dislocation of Palestinians, especially of fellahin, that is, farmers and farm workers, who lost access to tracts of prime farmlands that had formerly provided them a livelihood. Some also lost their places of residence, as the houses and properties were sold out from under them to well-financed Jewish organizations, in particular the Palestine branch of the Jewish Colonization Association. Some of the farmers who were pushed from the countryside towards urban centers in this way even wound up working in Jewish factories, where they were chronically underpaid because the minimum wage was lower for Arabs than for Jews. But that trend tapered off as Jewish groups became more determined to only hire other Jews. One way or the other, the locals found themselves increasingly marginalized. Eventually, this process was met with what were known as the Arab riots, which, a number of times, were so aggressive as to inflict casualties. In the worst of cases, Arab rioters marched into Jewish towns, vandalizing and killing indiscriminately. Jewish militias also attacked Palestinian villages and killed civilians. There are diverging stories of who engaged in violence first. It is generally stated to have been the locals, who felt as though their country was being taken over and their rights trampled. Or, to be more accurate with the help of historical hindsight, they realized it was being taken over, and with little regard to the conditions of their own existence. On the other hand, before the first serious riots took place, the pot was also stirred by overly zealous Arab newspaper articles and preachers who portrayed Jews practicing at the Wailing Wall as having designs to take over the Temple Mount, which for some centuries has been the location of the Al-Aqsa Mosque. The fervor heightened, both groups made allegations, developed grudges, and ultimately committed atrocities. Usually, British police broke things up, but often not before much harm was done. Of course, none of this prompted any resolution to the problems. Jews were still being persecuted in Europe and needed somewhere to go, but paradoxically, as they arrived and settled in Palestine, the rights of Palestinians themselves were an afterthought at best. This was made obvious by their actions, but the intention was also articulated by prominent Zionist leaders. For example, the head of the Jewish Agency in a speech quoted Dr. Weizmann, the first president of Israel, as saying, "The English told us that there are some hundreds of thousands of blacks there, and this has no importance." And his policies reflected that attitude, denying Palestinians of representative government and trying to determine outcomes without their direct input. Yet, Israelis and their proponents in the West tell us that Palestinians have had every opportunity for sovereignty and brought about their own demise by armed resistance, that Israel only fought in self-defense. In this, they are either being purposely deceptive, knowing that most people have not been educated on the historical facts and so are gullible to such spin, or, if sincere, are simply ignorant and misinformed themselves. which is not hard to fathom, considering they live in a state that spends hundreds of millions of dollars to whitewash its violent history and brainwash its citizens into embracing, even celebrating, the revised narrative. A scheme all too familiar for those of us in other colonial states, including the US, Canada, Australia, just to name a few. Likewise, conquest was in fact embedded in the very design of Zionism. David Ben-Gurion, the first Prime Minister of Israel, accepted the UN Partition plan, which as is already required displacement of Palestinians, but also said, quote, "On the basis of the assumption that after we build up a strong force following the establishment of the state, we will abolish the partition of the country and we will expand to the whole land." He also stated, "I support compulsory transfer. I do not see anything immoral in it." Golda Meir, the fourth Prime Minister, publicly pronounced, "There was no such thing as Palestinians." What better way to excuse yourself from erasing a people than by pretending they weren't there to begin with? Yet these leaders appear to have been able to disguise the depth of their discrimination for a time, just enough, by using watered-down rhetoric that would have been considered more politically correct, such as Gurion's claims that they would sooner or later find a compromise with the locals. It seems now, in retrospect, to have been a tactic of distraction, used to put off political decisions and delay the delineation of territories, that is, to avoid the setting of boundaries. Meanwhile, for locals on the ground who were getting the short end of things, the true objectives and effects of the Zionist project were undeniable. As resistance ramped up, colonial authorities clamped down. In 1937, the British brought in one of their officers who prior had been engaged in repression against the rebellions in Ireland and India. He taught the Israelis certain methods of torture and endorsed collective punishment, including confiscation of livestock, destruction of houses, and forced unpaid labor. Escalating tensions hit their peak during the Arab Revolt, which by 1939 left hundreds of Zionist Jews and thousands of Palestinians dead. Meanwhile, dozens of new Zionist settlements were built, whereas numerous Palestinian villages were destroyed. That would be the worst of it until the Nakba 9 years later. During the riots and the revolt, both groups accrued their casualties not only through fighting each other but also through independently fighting the British occupation. It is a sad and strange irony to realize that the same nation who helped defeat the Nazis would then in turn oppress Jews themselves. Britain's efforts during World War II might imply a nobility of sorts, yet based on the sum total of its actions, self-interest is the most succinct summary of the empire's motivations. Looking back, we can wonder, what if the two persecuted groups had reconciled rather than magnified their differences, joined forces against the empire, and built a free country together? But alas, such a fantasy is far from the reality of the negative feedback loops that have unfolded instead, with bullets flying in every direction. There were even instances of Zionists fighting Zionists, and of Palestinian peasants having been recruited by British forces fighting against Palestinian rebels, or being executed by the Mufti for lack of loyalty. Overall, the tentative alignment of Zionist and Western ideologies and goals has led to the Zionist entity becoming basically an extension of the empire, and using its industrial-scale weapons to continue to persecute the other group, all while claiming to still be the victim. The tendrils of colonial white supremacy have co-opted Jewish suffering in order to further perpetuate a racist political paradigm, with widespread and diluted accusations of anti-Semitism projected as a sort of shield for its more concrete but less socially acceptable and thus quasi-covert function, as an outpost of Western military domination in the East. So yes, as it turns out, it is complicated. The history of the region is deep, complex, multifaceted. To be thorough in its description would require an anthology, something I am not attempting to do. There are gaps in the knowledge even of professional historians, but there need not be gaps in our compassion, in our humanity. So I am asking each of us, all of us, to look more closely at the causes and effects that have led to the excruciating situation that we see today. I am asking us to cultivate a clearer perception of the overarching patterns, the root causes, and reflect on how to shift them in a direction that respects and honors all human lives and cultures. and even to have a little faith in the groups involved. That is, not to fall into the defeatist view that the conflict is intractable, because despite the cruelty we are witnessing right now from the state that misrepresents them, Jewish people were traditionally very good at that respect and honoring, and they still are, throughout the diaspora. As it is declared in their principles, the world rests on three things: justice, truth, and peace. Pray for the peace of Jerusalem. May those who love you find serenity. May there be well-being within your ramparts, serenity in your citadels. Turn from evil and do good. Seek peace and pursue it. You shall love truth and peace. And not only philosophically, there are a number of modern organizations, linked in the sources, that strive to exemplify those values and put them into action, regardless of and often directly contrary to the actions of the Israeli government. To any who may be tempted to tell me that I have cherry-picked the teachings, I would say to you, those, such as Benjamin Netanyahu and his cabinet of extremists, who refer only to the instances where the teachings permit violence, while ignoring the instances where the teachings preach compassion and peace, it is they who have misappropriated, they who degrade the culture by misrepresenting the core values of Judaism. My care for the Jewish people and culture is fully equal to my care for the Palestinian people and culture. Difference being, I see only one of the two ruling the other with an iron fist, after having taken nearly everything from them, under a corrupt government that has severely distorted said culture and weaponized it in order to colonize and oppress another group for decades on end, while being funded by the resources of the United States, no less, year after year, in the order of billions of dollars. Because of this, my silence would be complicity. That is a status quo I, for one, refuse to roll over and accept. Rewind. What happened? What prompted this modern Israeli faction into their apparent obsession with control, their implementation of martial law against the Palestinians? Where did they learn such tactics? Why did they adopt them? What radicalized them into such systemic and relentless aggression? Wasn't it undoubtedly their own oppressors who did it to them first? Displacement, concentration, discrimination, dehumanization, kickstarting what would evolve into a new regime now responsible for much of the same, a regime known globally for its neglect and outright abuse of human rights towards the inhabitants of Gaza and the West Bank, many of whom are refugees and the children of refugees, both of whom have never been allowed the right of return to their original homes since expulsion in 1948. And the U.S. bears much of the blame for enabling the oppression ever since, an abhorrent response to the original problem, which is even now directly fueling the series of catastrophes we are witnessing. Though what else would we expect from a nation that has mastered the governmental malpractices of misappropriation and state-sanctioned violence? 100 years later, and ultimately they are suffering and we are witnessing the ongoing fallout from the fact that Europeans turned against each other and allowed authoritarian leaders to take hold. Hitler and every member of his death cult chose hatred, chose blind rage, projection, blame, persecution, and trauma dominoed. The conquered became conqueror, became perpetrator, in order to never again become victim, falsely believing it must be one or the other. To fear for one's life, to fight for self-preservation, to protect one's tribe, is human. To weaponize that fear and make it impossible for other people to preserve their lives and their families is inhumane. Past abuse is not an excuse, yet it is something more relevant than that. It is the most apparent reason, which we can unravel all the way back, all the way down to the crusty foundations of these cycles of violence. Division, distrust, disdain, and ultimately demonization of those who are different than ourselves. I've been told it's just human nature, but I disagree. I believe human nature is compassion, is empathy, is care, is love, if you will. I believe it is human nature to be diverse, yet interconnected, is to appreciate rather than attack our differences. And yet, as many of us have experienced in our personal lives, and as we can see unfolding with exponential intensity in the human collective, hurt people hurt people. unless they are allowed to heal, supported to heal. The Jewish people were not truly supported to heal. They were promised an already inhabited region as a supposed safe haven, which they have been fighting to gain full control of ever since. The Palestinian people have not been supported nor allowed to heal. Since they were originally displaced and brutalized, they have been repeatedly robbed, blockaded, captured and imprisoned without charge or trial, i.e., taken hostage, by the thousands, and bombed, that going both ways, though with a massive differential in degree of capability, damage, death, and injuries. But in the ongoing quest to attain the public image of righteousness, the Israeli government and propagandists remind us that they pulled all settlers from Gaza in 2005, as if that was an unequivocal end to their abuse against Gaza. A lie by omission, for the blockade was never lifted. Palestinians were not given statehood nor equal rights as citizens, and probably worst of all, thousands of Palestinians were kept in Israeli prisons where they can be, and are routinely, kept under lock and key arbitrarily and indefinitely. Many reports and evidence of torture have been documented also. Notable as well is that in the same year that Israel withdrew its settlers from Gaza, about twice as many Israeli settlers as that moved into the West Bank, that being not only unethical but also illegal under international law. Also, external restrictions on Gaza were actually ramped up. The Israeli human rights organization Gisha provides examples of restrictions that continued or increased in the year following the supposed disengagement. Quote, Gaza residents may not bring a crate of milk into the Gaza Strip without Israeli permission. A Gaza university cannot receive visits from a foreign lecturer unless Israel issues a visitor's permit. A Gaza mother cannot register her child in the Palestinian population registry without Israeli approval. A Gaza fisherman cannot fish off the coast of Gaza without permission from Israel. A Gaza non-profit organization cannot receive a tax-exempt donation of goods without Israeli approval. A Gaza teacher cannot receive her salary unless Israel agrees to transfer tax revenues to the Palestinian Ministry of Education. A Gaza farmer cannot get his carnations and cherry tomatoes to market unless Israel permits the goods to exit Gaza. A Gaza student cannot study abroad without Israeli approval to open the Gaza-Egypt crossing. End quote. We might be inclined to split our blame fully between the Israeli government and other governments currently aiding and abetting. We absolutely should make every effort to hold those forces accountable as quickly and fully as possible. And still, ultimately, we need to dismantle the insidious underlying root causes, those being racism itself, which was let to fester, especially in Eastern Europe, and then, when concentrated through the lens of fascism, led to the abomination known as the Third Reich, colonialism, which led to the victors of World War I annexing territory in the Middle East and then attempting to hand it off to dispossessed Jewish people, and imperialism, which the U.S. has propagated through hundreds of proxy bases around the world, the highly militarized State of Israel virtually functioning as one of them. Some point to prior imperialism also, as having been responsible for an initial expulsion of Hebrew speakers from the Levant many centuries ago, and that bears relevance in regards to the region having been chosen for the relocation of Jewish people displaced from Europe during the 20th century. That being said, to rely on thousands of years old histories to try to dictate today who lives or dies, or who is allowed to steal land and homes, to randomly shoot children, and turn families into refugees, is an untenable position. To the modern-day Zionists, you cannot punish today's Palestinians for what Assyrian, Roman, and Arab armies did roughly 2,700, 2,000, and 1,300 years ago, and call it righteous. Nor can you pretend that you are just taking back what Arabs took from you. Both Jewish and Palestinian genetics can be traced back prior to Arabization of the area's population, to the time of Canaan. Ultimately, history does not dictate our shared humanity, or lack thereof. We do. Today. Now. By taking collective responsibility to end the cycles of one travesty leading to another. Aggression, revenge, retaliation, an apparent obsession with taking the pain and paying it forward to another vulnerable group. Ancestral trauma does not justify oppression against another people. Right now, the primary charge lands on you, Israeli officials and soldiers, who are directly doing the most harm and who must choose to end it. not with expulsion or annihilation of Palestinians, but with you choosing to hear your good conscience, choosing to have compassion, choosing to restore your own humanity as well as theirs, and by having the humility to see and acknowledge that 1. The vast majority of the people you are killing, injuring, and severely traumatizing are 100% innocent, and 2. Even the extremists amongst the resistance have only done the same thing you did, turned their overwhelming pain into a thirst for vengeance. One key difference being, you have much greater political and military power, and with it, more responsibility, to end the wanton destruction, not by pretending it's all their fault and slaughtering them, but by recognizing that they are just as human as you and choosing another way. Even if you care only for yourselves, remember, you are likely to reap what you sow. So will you keep sowing seeds of pain, or will you reclaim your humanity and start sowing seeds of peace? Indiscriminate violence is not a show of strength. It is a show of weakness. It is a show of deplorable character. It will be an unwashable stain upon your legacy, a stain spreading by the day, by the hour, by the minute, by the moment. It is and will be a disgrace to your culture. Only empathy and respect for our collective humanity can reconcile these conflicts. Every other road is a dead end, for them and for you. So choose wisely, Zion. For your sake, for theirs, for all of ours. Choose wisely. I recognize my position of privilege, the most essential privileges, those of relative safety, freedom, and sufficiency of my basic survival needs. This does not and will not hinder me from recognizing the fundamental human rights of other peoples and speaking out when they are being violated. To the contrary, it becomes my obligation, my duty as a citizen of the world. At any given time, I am going to side primarily with those who are most oppressed, most abused. Absolutely. But make no mistake, the intentional killing of innocent, unarmed civilians is never excusable. It is atrocious no matter the setting or provocation. That's not to say context doesn't matter. It does. Because although it cannot excuse, it can explain, in part, and can inform the course forward in order to avoid more of the same, to change the effects by addressing the causes, to try, above all, to end the senseless cycles of suffering. May we all choose wisely.